The day breaks slowly over the rugged slopes of Mount Warning. Mist clings to the valleys, curling through the dense foliage, muting color and sound alike. The mountain rises abruptly from the surrounding plain, a sentinel carved by ancient lava flows, its summit shrouded in clouds. Dawn is fragile, light filtering weakly through the gray, lending an almost monochrome pallor to the terrain. High above, a single-engine Stinson Model A cuts through the morning haze. Its polished fuselage reflects the soft light, wings gliding over the undulating landscape with mechanical precision. The aircraft's twin engines hum steadily, but the harmony of their sound is deceiving. The mountain looms ahead, visibility is poor, and the pilot's instruments offer only limited guidance. From the cockpit, the terrain is a patchwork of mist and shadow. Pilots of the 1930s relied on visual cues and primitive navigation charts, a fragile tether between human skill and unforgiving nature. A single misjudgment, a subtle misread of altitude, a momentary lapse in situational awareness, could have irreversible consequences. Below, the forested slopes wait silently. There is no drama, no roar of engines, only the quiet accumulation of conditions that will converge in minutes. The aircraft descends steadily, a mechanical ballet unaware of the fatal geometry of the landscape. The weight of history presses silently over the scene. In the coming moments, life, technology, and terrain will intersect in a way that will shape aviation safety for decades to come. Even now, the sight holds a hushed reverence, a reminder of the fragile margin between flight and accident. The story that follows is not merely of a crash. It is a study in risk, decision-making, and the relentless challenge of early aviation. In the early 1930s, Australian aviation was in a period of cautious expansion. Air travel offered unprecedented speed across vast, often inhospitable terrain, yet it remained a fragile enterprise. Aircraft were modest by today's standards, relatively light, single or twin-engine designs, often constructed from wood, fabric, and steel tubing. Safety protocols existed but were rudimentary, largely relying on pilot skill, experience, and judgment. The Stinson Model A, introduced in the United States in the early 1930s, represented one of the more advanced civil aircraft of its time. With a high wing and fixed landing gear, it could carry 4 to 5 passengers and a pilot, powered by a dependable radial engine. Its design emphasized stability and simplicity over speed. Pilots valued it for reliability on regional routes, but it had limitations. Instrumentation was minimal, navigation aids were almost non-existent, and terrain awareness depended entirely on sight and charts. Mount Warning itself posed a unique challenge. Rising abruptly from the surrounding plains, its slopes are steep and forested. The peak is often shrouded in low-lying clouds, with sudden wind shifts and turbulence. In 1934, there were no radar systems, no radio beacons, and very few established flight corridors. Pilots approached such terrain with respect, combining local knowledge with charted routes. Yet even familiarity offered only partial protection against the mountain's hidden hazards. The flight in question was a regional service, connecting small communities and delivering passengers and mail with the precision and reliability expected of early commercial aviation. Pilots operated under time pressure, often navigating by dead reckoning or visual cues through weather that could change suddenly. The combination of mechanical limitations, environmental unpredictability, and human judgment created a narrow margin for error. Understanding this backdrop is essential. The crash that would occur was not an isolated event, nor the result of recklessness. It was the product of a technological era in transition. Aviation at the edge of human skill, guided by instruments that could only hint at the landscape below. The Stinson Model A's approach to Mount Warning illustrates both the promise and peril of early flight. The Stinson Model A was a product of early 1930s aviation engineering. Stable, forgiving in level flight, yet constrained by the limitations of its era. Its radial engine, a hallmark of reliability, produced sufficient power for short-haul flights but lacked redundancy in extreme conditions. The fixed landing gear minimized mechanical complexity but added drag, reducing climb performance. Instruments were minimal. Airspeed, altimeter, compass, and engine gauges formed the pilot's primary toolkit. There was no radio navigation, no artificial horizon, no terrain warning system. Flight in reduced visibility demanded careful calculation, patience, and acute situational awareness. The crew brought experience, yet even seasoned pilots were vulnerable to environmental pressures. Decision-making relied on visual navigation and familiarity with regional landmarks. Fatigue, the pressure to maintain schedules, and the mental workload of interpreting incomplete data could amplify small errors. For the 1930s pilot, misjudging altitude over rising terrain, especially in poor visibility, was a subtle but ever-present hazard. Environmental factors compounded the risk. Mount warning slopes rise abruptly from surrounding lowlands, creating sudden wind shear and turbulence. Fog and low clouds could form rapidly in the morning hours, masking terrain and flattening visual cues. Shadows from dense forests and uneven ground could deceive even the most attentive observer, making distance judgment difficult. Sunlight filtering through mist further complicates perception, producing optical illusions over valleys and ridges. Systems analysis highlights the interaction between machine, human, and environment. The Stinson's limited instrumentation meant that pilots depended heavily on external cues. A small misalignment in heading or an underestimation of altitude loss could result in controlled flight into terrain, CFIT. There were no warnings, no alerts, only the slow accumulation of conditions that, in combination, would create a fatal trajectory. Viewed together, the aircraft, crew, environment, and systems formed an intricate web. Each element was capable alone, yet each depended on the others functioning within narrow margins. The crash at Mount Warning would demonstrate the fragility of early aviation, where mechanical reliability could not compensate for human limitations, and human skill was constantly tested by unforgiving landscapes. The final moments of the flight unfolded with quiet inevitability. The Stinson Model A, descending through low cloud and morning mist, approached Mount Warning from the northwest. Visibility was reduced, shadows obscured the subtle rise of the terrain, and the radial engine's steady hum masked the danger below. The pilot, relying on sight and memory of the charted route, believed the aircraft maintained sufficient clearance. Instruments confirmed airspeed and altitude, but there was no device capable of detecting the approaching mountain. At this stage, the aircraft was in a stable glide. There was no mechanical failure, no dramatic engine surge or stall. The era was one of perception. Situational awareness gradually eroded by weather, topography, and reliance on minimal instrumentation. As the aircraft closed the slopes, the subtle misjudgment of altitude became critical. Trees broke the outline of the terrain, and gusts of wind shifted the aircraft slightly from its intended path. There was no warning, no sudden alarm, only the compounding of small deviations. The Stinson struck the forested mountainside at low forward speed. The impact was immediate and catastrophic, yet brief and devoid of cinematic flair. The aftermath was silence. The forest absorbed the energy of the collision. Early investigators would later describe the wreckage as compact and contained, a testament to the aircraft's design integrity, yet a stark illustration of human and technological vulnerability in early flight. There were no miraculous recoveries. The conditions and chain of errors left no margin for escape. This accident was not the result of recklessness or mechanical failure. It was a convergence of early aviation's limitations, the natural environment, and human reliance on perception over technology. The Stinson Model A, the crew, and the mountain were locked in precise, tragic geometry, a controlled flight into terrain born of circumstance, skill, and the unforgiving nature of the 1930 skies. In the days following the crash, a team of investigators from Australian civil aviation authorities and local police descended on the remote slopes of Mount Warning. Access was difficult. Steep terrain and dense forest slowed progress. Yet methodical work began immediately. Investigators documented the scene, photographed wreckage locations, and measured altitudes and flight paths. Every detail mattered, from the angle of descent to the condition of the engines and control surfaces. Technical analysis confirmed the Stinson Model A was mechanically sound. Engines were intact, controls functioned normally, and structural failure was not a factor. The aircraft instrumentation was verified as fully operational. The tragedy lay elsewhere. The investigation identified a controlled flight into terrain, CFIT, scenario. The aircraft had descended under visual flight rules into low visibility conditions without sufficient margin for terrain clearance. The crew's judgment, constrained by the limits of 1930s navigation, was a central factor. Weather record corroborated early reports of fog and low cloud cover over the mountain at the time of the flight. Winds, shifting unpredictably along ridges, may have subtly altered the aircraft's trajectory. Investigators concluded that even small deviations in heading or altitude, when compounded with the mountain's abrupt slopes and limited instrumentation, created an unrecoverable scenario. The public and media response was subdued but respectful. Early aviation had become part of everyday life, yet each accident reminded communities of the inherent risks. Airlines, manufacturers, and authorities faced mounting pressure to improve safety standards, operational procedures, and navigational aids. The Mount Warning crash, though tragic, catalyzed measured reflection rather than sensational outrage. Ultimately, the investigation highlighted a chain of circumstances rather than a single point of failure. It demonstrated how early aircraft, capable crews, and challenging terrain could converge into disaster when environmental and technological limitations intersected. Lessons were drawn not from dramatic failure, but from careful study of preventable pattern, forming the foundation for changes that would improve aviation safety for decades. The Stinson Model A crash at Mount Warning left no survivors, but its legacy endured in the measured improvements it inspired. Aviation authorities took note of the vulnerabilities exposed: reliance on visual navigation in poor visibility, limited instrumentation, and the hazards posed by abrupt terrain. Procedures were refined to include greater altitude margins over mountainous regions, more rigorous weather assessments, and clearer guidance for early commercial flights operating in marginal conditions. Aircraft design also evolved. The importance of redundancy, improved instrumentation, and more reliable navigational aids became increasingly apparent. The Stinson, a capable and reliable aircraft for its time, exemplified the limits of technology when combined with environmental challenges. Future designs incorporated better visibility for pilots, enhanced structural resilience, and more sophisticated cockpit instruments, precursors to modern situational awareness tools. The tragedy highlighted a broader principle in aviation. Accidents are rarely the result of a single factor. Instead, they are the product of interacting elements: aircraft capabilities, human decision-making, environmental conditions, and systemic limitations. The careful study of Mount Warning informed not only procedural improvements, but also the emerging discipline of accident investigation as a scientific method, emphasizing analysis, documentation, and prevention over speculation. Decades later, pilots and engineers still reference CFIT scenarios when designing training programs and safety protocols. The Mount Warning accident became a cautionary example. Respect for terrain, recognition of environmental hazards, and the discipline to follow procedural safety margins can mean the difference between life and death. As the morning mist clears over Mount Warning, the mountain remains unchanged, silent and imposing. The story of the Stinson Model A is etched into history not as spectacle, but as a sober lesson in risk, responsibility, and the relentless pursuit of safer flight. In that quiet reflection lies the enduring value of aviation memory, knowledge gained from loss, guiding generations toward safer skies.